Welkom met de Andere Krant. The European Commission is at the threshold of deregulating new GMOs. They promise that they will solve our problems and that little or no risk is involved. But how realistic is this? Today our guest is Claire Robinson, Managing Director of GMWatch and author of the book GMO Myths and Truths, to share her knowledge about the impacts of these impending regulations. Claire, welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me, and hello to all our listeners. I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Claire Robinson. I'm the co-director and co-editor of GMWatch, which is an organisation which works to inform the public about the reasons to be cautious regarding genetic engineering in food and agriculture.
Good, thank you. So, Claire, recently the European Commission, they proposed that perhaps the new genomic techniques are going to be fully deregulated, and they promise that this will solve world hunger. This can be used to combat a lot of issues we were dealing with. It will create drought-tolerant plants. We won't need to use more pesticides. So there are a lot of promises that they give with these new genomic technique and traditional GMOs. And can you explain to us how realistic these promises are?
Yes. First thing to remember is that this is not the first time we have heard these promises. I'm old enough to remember the first round of GMOs when they were first released in the mid-1990s. And they came accompanied by all the same promises. These crops are going to feed the world. They're going to yield more. They're going to use less pesticides. They're going to be good for climate and the environment. Mm-hmm. We've heard it all before. I'm afraid none of these promises have come to fruition. And in fact, the reverse has happened. In the case of GM soy, for example, which is the mm-hmm. most widespread GM crop in the world, the yields are actually worse than with non-GM soy. That's well established. They really have not increased yields, and even the US government, which is a promoter of GM crops, admits mm-hmm. that in its own reports. They don't increase yields. The reduction of pesticides thing, well, actually most GM crops are tolerant to herbicides, weed killers. Like glyphosate, which is a suspected carcinogen. Mm-hmm. So basically the rollout of these GM herbicide-tolerant crops, they are engineered to survive being sprayed with huge amounts of glyphosate herbicide and other herbicides as well. And they mm-hmm. have increased the use of these herbicides many, many times. So it's been a disaster in those countries where they grow a lot of GM crops like Argentina and Brazil. There's major public health problems with the spraying. And, are they going to produce more nutritious crops? No. We've been promised golden rice now for decades, which is, mm-hmm. Engineered to contain a vitamin A precursor. And it was designed, to feed the malnourished people in the third world. Mm-hmm. At least that was the claim. It still is not. It's being grown commercially. We hear now in the Philippines it's finally got approval, but it is never going to do what is promised, because basically people are malnourished because they are poor. It's mm-hmm. nothing to do with them lacking vitamin A precursor engineered into rice. The cause of hunger is not the lack of those kind of silver bullet crops. The cause of hunger mm-hmm. is poverty. People cannot afford to buy the food that is available in abundance in every single country in the world. You know, you hear about some countries having famines at certain point. Mm-hmm. Some countries in Africa, some areas of India have had famines. These are never caused by a lack of food production. There is actually a surplus of food in the world. And mm-hmm. if you go to those countries, you will find that there's plenty of food available for those who have money to buy it. Mm-hmm. But people are hungry because they lack money. Sometimes those countries lack infrastructure, so crops will rot in warehouses and they cannot be got to the people who are hungry because there are no efficient storage or transport systems. And hunger is basically a political problem, it's a socio-economic problem, and it has to be dealt with through those means. It is not going to be dealt with by engineering some isolated nutrient into some crop that never had it in. That is a very silly approach. We know that there are problems with golden rice, for instance. The vitamin A precursor declines in storage. It has to be vacuum packed, etc. So really, we've had no fulfilled promises from the first generation of GM crops. Now we're hearing exactly the same promises regarding the second generation of GM crops, but basically these problems that GM crops are being claimed to address are not the kind of problems that can be solved by manipulating one or a few genes in a crop. Name me any problem in food or agriculture these days, and it is a system problem. It has to be addressed by addressing the systems. So if there's if we're worried about a shortage of nitrogen to boost crops, for example, there are many natural processes that we can use to enrich soil with nitrogen, and those processes need to be implemented. There are systems of farming that do not use pesticides. We know that pesticides are not necessary to agriculture. You can keep production. It's necessary for agribusiness. Agribusiness needs pesticides because that's what they make and that's what they market. It's not necessary to grow our food. It's not necessary to protect crops. There are other ways of doing that. So my prediction is that these new GM crops are not going to solve any of these problems. So people ask me, what is it really about? What is this rollout, this big push behind new GM crops to get them deregulated? It is, of course, about money. It's about the agrochemical companies, which are also GMO seed companies, producing GM seeds, which are often dependent on that same company's chemicals. So typically they will sell the GM seed along with a package of chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, and say, here, they sell them to the farmers, and the farmers grow that GM seed as a package with the chemicals. It's also about patents, because GMOs are inventions. So because they are not natural, they can be patented, and all of them are controlled by a whole raft of patents. There's patents on the product itself, on the seed itself, and also patents on the technologies used to genetically engineer those seeds. So every time somebody plants a GM seed or eats a GM food, we are enriching the companies that are making those GM seeds. And typically they are the very big biotech firms. Firms like Corteva, used to be Dow DuPont, they control most of the patents on gene editing techniques. And also Bayer Monsanto owns a lot of patents. So those are the companies that are interested in this technology. They're interested in intellectual property and patents. And this is what it's all about.
So perhaps for our listeners, can you explain the difference between traditional GMOs and the new GMOs or new breeding techniques, and what are their arguments to deregulate them?
Yes. Okay, so we hear a lot now about a new genetic engineering suite of technologies, really, called gene editing. And the most commonly used one is CRISPR. And everywhere you read in the media, CRISPR is hyped. You know, CRISPR is going to cure all these diseases. It's going to give us, lab-grown milk and meat. It's going to give us these wonder crops, GM crops, that are going to solve all our food and farming problems. CRISPR is hyped to the skies. Basically what gene editing, what CRISPR does is it makes a double strand cut in the DNA. It just cuts across the two strands of the DNA, and then it's left to the cell's own repair processes to repair that cut. Unfortunately, it's not precise. It's not predictable. All kinds of things can go wrong in gene editing, and there are plenty of studies now to show that even though it is termed a precise technique, it is, by the way, a genetic modification technique. So never let anybody tell you differently. It's GM. It's just a new kind of GM. The difference between the old GM and the new GM is that with the older GM techniques, the insertion of the gene that you were trying to put into the plant or animal was random. It was randomly inserted. You didn't know where in the genome it was going to go. With gene editing, you can target that change to a specific site in the genome, a specific sequence in the genome. So that is why people call it precise. But that is the only precise aspect of it, because after that cut in the genome has happened, all kinds of things can happen. The repair process isn't precise, and you can get cuts in places in the genome that you did not intend. You can have bits of the gene editing tool can fragment and stay in the final gene edited product. You can have large insertions, deletions, and rearrangements of DNA. All these things that are unintended effects from gene editing. So there's an awful lot that can go wrong. What worried us most about the first generation of GM crops is that when you're messing around with the genome in such a profound way, you can end up with a plant particularly that might be toxic or allergenic. Because you're changing the biochemistry of the plant. And plants are naturally, even in their non-GM natural form, plants have a tendency to be very good at making their own toxins. And they do this in order to repel diseases, repel pests, etc., and to cope with environmental changes. However, breeders over the centuries have made conventional breeding extremely safe because they know with every particular plant that might be prone to making toxins, notably potatoes and celery, they know exactly what to look for. So with potatoes, they know that they have to look for these toxic substances called glycoalkaloids, which if they reach a certain high level can be dangerous to eat. So they know to look for that. Likewise with celery, they know what to look for and make sure they don't put a toxic potato or celery out there in the food supply. Now with genetic modification and gene editing, you don't have that knowledge of what can go wrong. So you can end up with new toxins and allergens in the plant or altered levels of existing toxins and allergens. And you can say, sometimes people say, oh yes, but GM crops have been out there for decades and nobody has died yet as a result of eating one. Well, the problem is that this is an uncontrolled experiment because nobody in the US particularly, where most GM crops are eaten by humans, nobody's doing a controlled experiment. So if there was a rise in allergies or in cancer even, nobody would know what the cause was.
No.
However, we do have a lot of animal feeding studies on the first generation of GM crops, which do show that they can have toxic and allergenic effects. And that includes GM crops that have actually successfully found their way through the authorization process and they are in the food and feed supply. And we know that when these crops are fed to animals in the lab, controlled study, one group of animals fed the GM crop, another group of animals fed the non-GM equivalent. So we know that in animal feeding experiments, these are controlled experiments where one group of animal is fed the GM crop and another group of animals is fed the non-GM equivalent crop. We know that they can have, some of these crops can have toxic or allergenic effects, and that is well proven. These are peer-reviewed studies. We collected them, at least some of them, we collected them in a book that I wrote with two genetic engineers called GMO Myths and Truths. You can find that book on Amazon, and I always recommend that people get the most up-to-date version, which is the 4th edition. There is a link to it from the GMWatch site, and there's a whole chapter in that book summarizing the findings of these animal feeding studies. And typically the results that scientists have seen have been liver and kidney toxicity and immune reactions.
Okay.
And immune reactions is a concern because obviously food allergies are going up and up all the time, particularly in children. And it would be good to know why that is. I think in Europe, it's not so much the GM element because we're eating very few GM crops in Europe because at the moment they do have to be labeled. And this means that retailers have basically rejected putting them into human food. But certainly in the US, people are eating GM foods and crops. And we do know several pediatricians, doctors who actually prescribe a non-GM and organic diet for their patients, particularly children. And they find really remarkable results when the people come off the GMOs and pesticides and adopt an organic non-GMO diet. So you were asking about the push to deregulate these things. What we're told in the EU is that the new generation of GM crops, particularly those produced with gene editing, are so natural that they are safe and that the changes brought about in gene editing are no different from what can happen naturally, and therefore they're completely predictable, completely safe, safe as non-GM, and therefore they do not need to be regulated. And we think that is extremely dangerous. I'm not a scientist, but we are in touch with scientists all the time. And in fact, there is a statement online at the moment with a title, something like gene editing is not precision breeding. And it's a statement signed by 100 scientists saying that calling gene editing precision breeding is dishonest, it's misleading, it's scientifically inaccurate because these techniques are not precise, they're not controlled, and the effects are not predictable. And so therefore they need to be regulated as GMOs and continue to be safety assessed. In the EU, every GMO at the moment has to go through a safety assessment for health and environment, and it has to be traceable, fully traceable from the seed to the fork, the dinner table, and it has to be labelled. And if we deregulate these new generation of GMOs, and that means remove regulatory controls from, then we will have none of those things. We won't have traceability, we won't have labelling, and we won't have the safety checks either. So that's a very serious development, and it's one that we must oppose.
And it eliminates choice.
Totally. It eliminates choice for both the consumer and also the farmer, because we need our seeds labelled so that farmers know what they're planting. And this is not just about the relatively small organic sector. This is about the non-GMO sector, which at the moment is the vast majority of farming in the EU is non-GMO. And there's plenty of retailers, plenty of farmers who want to keep that non-GMO choice. But if this deregulation goes ahead, the danger is that we can lose that traceability, we lose the labelling, farmers won't know what they're growing, and consumers won't know what they're buying and eating.
So in the US, you have the non-GMO initiative, which is a private initiative. So it's still like for the producers who want to stay non-GMO, they can get this type of label. Do we have anything similar in the EU?
Not yet. Well, actually, That's not true. There's no real Europe-wide non-GMO labelling.
Mm-hmm.
What there is some schemes, particularly in Germany and Austria,
Mm-hmm.
where they have non-GMO certified production.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's particularly common when it comes to milk and eggs.
Okay.
The animals are non-GMO fed for a certain part of their lives.
Okay.
So they do have that labelling, and the label is run by an organisation called VLOG, VLOG, and they have a label which says ohne Gentechnik. You'll have to excuse my pronunciation. I don't speak German, but it's basically produced without genetic engineering. At the moment, of course, they have not gone into crops because, we don't have any GM crops that are actually destined for human food, although we do import plenty for animal feed. But I have always predicted that if deregulation does go ahead in Europe, which I really hope it doesn't, if it does go ahead, the non-GMO project, as in America, I think will come to Europe and set up a branch here. And basically what that means is that producers will have to pay the non-GMO project to get certification that their product is non-GMO. And that has to include gene editing, because the non-GMO project does not accept gene editing in its certification program. I don't want this to happen because clearly one would end up paying a premium for non-GMO food, and at the moment, it has to be labelled. That is the law, and that's what we want to keep.
And I understand there are also challenges with the gene-edited products, that they don't have good ways to test for them. Is that correct?
It's much said at the moment. It is claimed all over the place. What we do know is that if a GMO developer is required to release the details of the genetic sequence of that GMO, along with genetic sequence of a non-GMO parent variety from which the GMO is derived. This is currently required by the current GMO regulations in the EU. And also the developer has to supply a detection test to the authorities. Before a GMO can be released on the market, they need what's called the reference material, the GMO and non-GMO material. And they need the detection test from the developer. That is currently required for every GMO. Now, if the Commission gets its way and goes ahead and deregulates these things, all those requirements will be thrown out of the window. So the GMO developer will not need to tell us the sequence of his GMO. He will not need to supply the reference material so that the laboratories know what to look for. And of course, there'll be no labelling. So basically, the Commission is throwing its own requirements out of the door that would enable it to detect all these new GMOs. Yes, they can be detected down to, even if you have a gene-edited plant that is only changed a single DNA base pair or something. So it's a tiny change in the gene-edited plant. That can be detected with the correct test. We know this for a fact now. Every plant variety can be characterized by these tests that it can be subjected to. And the plant breeding industry uses these molecular tests to identify different varieties. If you have a variety of corn growing in your garden, you would like to know what variety that is. You can get it tested and identified. So they can certainly use the same techniques on GMOs. The reason the Commission keeps saying it's not possible is that they have refused to fund the EU's detection labs in order to develop the tests for each new GMO. But even without that, if we just continue to demand this material and the information on the GMO from the GMO developer, all these problems of detection would not exist.
Mm-hmm. So I read an article by a French NGO, I think it's called OGM, and they said if this legislation passes or the deregulation, then it will also be possible for these companies to even patent natural plants because they won't be obliged to give the genetic sequences. And what I thought, I'm not sure if that was in the article, but I thought all these small farmers, all the small breeder companies that are more focusing on heirloom seeds, they don't have the money to do these lawsuits and win them. So
exactly,
that's
it's a major issue, and I totally agree with that NGO that said that, and I'm familiar with the article. They are absolutely right, and already biotech companies are rushing to patent natural non-GM crops because they have certain traits that the company claims to have discovered or invented even. And it's complete nonsense. You know, this patenting of non-GM crops should not happen. Breeders need to keep access to all of the germplasm that they can possibly get their hands on. At the moment, plant breeders' protection laws already protect breeders' rights. You know, you can produce a variety, and it is your variety, and you will be sure to profit from the sales of that variety. But what you cannot do under plant breeders' rights is tie up the germplasm and say, everybody else cannot use my bean or my potato for breeding because I own that non-GM plant. You can't say that. But with patenting, as the biotech industry is patenting more and more non-GM varieties, that is the danger. The germplasm is going to be tied up in their control. Nobody will have access to it. It's an outrage, actually. It's like an enclosure of the commons. I'm not sure whether that makes sense in any other language other than English, but in England we used to have these things called the commons, which were recognised as commonly owned.
Yes.
And you know, bit by bit, these commons tend to be taken away from us. You know, things are privatised, things are locked away. This is something that must not happen with seeds. It's very important.
Because I thought that wasn't possible. Or I thought there were rulings that said that you cannot patent life, like as you say, that those are the commons, and that the patents are only possible on the genetically modified seeds. But already natural seeds are being patented.
Yeah,
wow.
that is the problem, and I think there are specialists on this that you can interview, and I would recommend that because my knowledge on this is limited. But groups like Test Biotech, Christoph Teen, who is in Test Biotech, also is in an organisation called No Patents on Seeds, and they track applications for patents on non-GM organisms, and they have opposed certain patents being applied for on non-GM organisms, and I believe they've been victorious. So, as you say, it is a big burden, really, on organisations that don't have money to make legal challenges for these things. But I understand they have done so and they have been successful. But we should not have to fight for these things.
No, because already I believe there was this report, I think the food barons, and they showed a oligopoly power in the food industry, but they show that the seeds are already controlled by 4 big companies.
Yes.
And you can imagine that these companies have enormous litigation power. So,
absolutely.
Yes.
And the consolidation in the seed industry has been getting more and more over the past few decades, and it's now reached extremely high levels. So this again is something that's very bad. We need to keep a diversity of seed companies, and also ultimately farmers and growers need to keep control of their own seeds. This is something that is increasingly being outlawed all over the world by so-called seed variety protection laws. And these laws are criminalizing the saving of seeds. And I remember when I first started out doing GM work in the 1990s, and I predicted then that the way it was going with the patents on GM seeds, I predicted that the way it was going is that all seeds would be patented and owned, the commercial seeds, and that seed saving by farmers would be criminalized. And people told me I was mad, conspiracy theorist. But, you know, this is happening. The conspiracy theory becomes a reality. This is exactly their agenda, and they don't want people keeping control of their seeds. But that is something that we have to fight for more than anything else, I would say.
Because it's also then about the control of the food supply.
It is, yes, and certainly we do not want these few big companies in control of our food and seed supply. They are the worst possible stewards of food sovereignty, diversity, agricultural diversity, all these things that we need for resilient systems going forward. These companies are in opposition to that. They're about monocultures. They're about standardization of seeds. We know that in times of drought, what you need is population genetics. So a whole variety of a big genetic variety. I know some farmers during the drought were planting many different varieties of wheat, all in the same field. And they got much higher yields than the farmers who were depending on one variety, which perhaps didn't do well in drought, and so the whole field would suffer. But population genetics is really important. Diversity is important, and we need to protect the rights to plant farmer-saved, diverse seed that's in our own control, in the control of the farmers.
Good. So. Also about the seeds in our control, I read about the terminator seeds. Is that something they can do with the gene editing techniques as well, or is that a real GMO technique?
I would imagine, now you'd have to ask a genetic engineer this question. I would imagine you can do it with gene editing. Terminator seeds, terminator technology was not commercialized so far as I know, because there was a massive global outcry against it. Terminator technology is a genetic engineering technology, which means that the seeds that the plant produces will be sterile. So you can only plant one generation of seeds, and after that you can't get seed from them and plant it on. And it was a big concern that the terminated genes would escape into other plants. Plants in general might become infertile, and this was considered such a threat to farming and diversity that the companies who developed terminator technology, definitely Monsanto, maybe others as well, said we will not commercialize it. Now, there is something else which often gets confused with terminator technology, which is the fact that the patenting system that applies to GM crops means that you are banned from saving seed. If as a farmer you plant a GM crop, you are legally banned from saving seed and replanting that seed. You cannot do it because it's infringing the patent of the patent owner. So farmers have got into trouble for saving seed from Monsanto crops and replanting. Monsanto has then taken them to court, and the results have been extremely expensive for the farmers. So that's something else. The inability to plant seed legally from a GM crop is separate from terminator, but they're both things that we should be concerned about.
Yes, and so you spoke about the health effect, like the allergies and the toxins, but what are the effects of introducing these gene-edited or genetically modified plants into nature?
We absolutely don't know, because not only do we not know what effects they're going to have on nature, we also don't know what effects they're going to have on us if we eat them, because nobody is doing the risk research. Nobody is doing animal feeding studies, such as were done on the first generation of GM crops. Nobody's doing those on the new generation. So we simply do not know what the health effects will be.
Mm-hmm.
We do not know what effects there will be on nature either, because these GM crops, new GM crops, have not been subjected to proper risk testing. They simply haven't. So it's a black box. We don't know. And what amazes me is that the European Commission can, apparently there are rational people in the EU Commission, but this is a new technology. We have no idea what the risks are. But there's every reason to believe that they might be similar to the risks of the first generation technology, GM technology. And we simply don't know. And in that state of don't know, the EU Commission is saying, oh, these things are natural. We can just go ahead and deregulate them. Well, no, that's not the way that proper technology assessment works. We should be working out the risks on the basis of experimental data.
Yes.
You know, if they tested 50 to 100 of these new GM crops, put them through molecular analysis, fed them to some animals in a controlled trial, and they found absolutely nothing at all that was wrong, I personally would be reassured. I'd think, okay, so maybe I don't need to worry about that. Why aren't they doing this? The kind of money that's needed to do an animal feeding trial, yes, it would be a lot to you and I, but to companies like Bayer and Dow DuPont, Corteva, it's peanuts, it's nothing. They could very easily do these studies. Even without the animal feeding studies, they could do molecular analyses, what we call omics analyses, see if there are any new toxins, allergens, strange metabolites that shouldn't be there. These tests should be being done. But if they are being done, they're certainly not publishing them. There's nothing in the public domain by the companies, by the developers. So it's an unknown. And the Commission is being extremely irresponsible in pushing deregulation of these things before we know what they're going to do.
So, because there's the health aspect, but there's also with the traditional GMOs, I believe that like organic farmers next to a GMO field, their fields get contaminated or they create super weeds. Like, what do we know about the environmental effects of traditional GMOs? Like
the environmental effects of first generation GMOs, we do know quite a bit. And again, this research was not done by the developers. It was done by independent scientists. We know that herbicide-tolerant crops, as I mentioned before, have vastly increased the use of herbicides. That has affected many species, including most notably the monarch butterfly, which in the United States feeds off the larvae feed off a single plant, which is milkweed. And what has happened is that the spraying of glyphosate herbicide on GM glyphosate tolerant crops has wiped out the milkweed. So monarch butterflies, from being a very abundant species, are now endangered, critically endangered. It's because their food has been wiped out. We know that with GM BT crops, which BT crops are a kind of insecticidal crop, the crop has been genetically engineered to contain an insecticide in every cell. And we know that those crops have bad effects, adverse effects on certain beneficial insects, including things like ladybirds, lacewings. These particular insects are very helpful to farmers because they eat pests. And if you're wiping out those insects, that is obviously a very bad thing. there are also there's a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of escape of transgenes. Transgenes just means the GM genes that have been engineered in. So genes for herbicide tolerance have spread to wild plants, related plants, and those weeds then become impossible for the farmers to kill with herbicides. But basically, what has happened with the superweeds is really, really serious, because the farmers, because they can no longer wipe out their weeds with glyphosate, they're having to turn to other herbicides. So the total herbicide mix going on those fields now is absolutely immense, and the biotech industry's response to glyphosate-resistant weeds was actually to make GM crops that are resistant to many types of herbicide. So you now have GM crops that can tolerate 3 or 5 different herbicides, and the farmers will be spraying all those herbicides because they can get away with it. It won't kill their GM crop, but it will kill everything else. So there's that happening. In America, there is also a major problem with dicamba-tolerant crops. Dicamba is a herbicide, and it's a very toxic herbicide. When it is sprayed on a GM crop field, what happens is that the dicamba herbicide volatilizes. It goes up into the air in a kind of cloud, drifts onto other non-dicamba-tolerant crops, kills them. It is killing farmers' non-GM crops. It's killing wild plants like trees. It's killing peach orchards. There was a peach farmer who brought a lawsuit, and he won damages of millions of dollars because the dicamba herbicide that was sprayed on neighboring GM crops wiped out his peach orchard. There's even been a murder because one farmer protested against his crops being damaged by the dicamba spray. And the neighbor farmer who was doing the spraying went and shot the guy. They had an argument, and so there was a murder. So this is what's happening. It's turning farmer against farmer, community against community. I would not like to be a farmer in America at the moment. I think it's created a very toxic environment. And you have to look at these GM seed firms as agents of death. That is what they've become. They're killing wildlife. They are responsible for killing people as well. In Argentina, in GM soy growing areas, the people suffer birth defects, cancers. This is well known now. So these are just destructive companies who do not have our best interests at heart.
Wow. So it's not only the plants that they're gene editing, but I also read that they are gene editing trees and bacteria and animals. Are these already on the market, or is this just a research stage?
In the case of the trees, they are not yet commercialized.
Okay.
They are trying to commercialize GM trees. I believe these are trees made with old style transgenic technology. They're trying to commercialize those in America at the moment, South America as well. But there's a big opposition against it. There are movements that are opposing that. We ourselves have signed on to various joint letters and petitions and so forth. So there are people fighting it. The gene editing of livestock is in progress, livestock animals like cattle and pigs. And already things have gone wrong. In the case of gene edited cattle, some people in America decided to edit the genes of cattle to make them hornless so they don't grow horns. And this was claimed as an animal welfare benefit because when animals are kept in overcrowded, highly stressful conditions, they will sometimes gore each other with their horns and or sometimes their handlers. Now, I happen to know that near us we have a couple of biodynamic farms where they actually deliberately keep the horns on the cows. They say that they are extensions of their senses. Cows can sense things through their horns, and so they need them. And I said, have you ever had any problems with animals goring each other with their horns or attacking the handlers? And they said, never. It simply never happens because these animals are not stressed. They're kept in plenty of space. They don't need to defend their space so much. So also the fact that there are non-GM, hornless cattle, naturally polled cattle out there, if that's what you want. And some very good breeding stock as well. This is widely available. Anyway, these gene editors in America said we're going to gene edit cattle to be hornless, something that absolutely was not needed. They did it, and what they found, well, actually, they didn't find. They said, they put out a statement saying, our animals are free from any unintended effects of the gene editing. And we thought, the media just repeated that claim uncritically. Then what happened was that the Food and Drug Administration, the US FDA, the regulator, some scientists at the FDA had a bit of time on her hands. I think the lockdowns were involved. And all of a sudden she found herself at home with not much to do. So she decided to analyze the genetic sequence of these gene-edited cattle, which the sequence was in the public domain. So she did that. And the scientists who decided to look into this, she and her colleagues, what they found was that the gene-edited cattle had unintendedly incorporated bacterial DNA, which encoded for several different types of antibiotic resistance. So what does this mean? What are the practical implications of that? Well, the implications are that if those genes, antibiotic resistance genes, get into bacteria, maybe gut bacteria, we're faced with the growth of antibiotic resistant pathogens, perhaps, diseases that don't respond to antibiotics. And we know that this is a major public health problem anyway. The danger was that these genes might get out, they might get into bacteria, and then we'd be faced with antibiotic resistant bacteria, an extra layer of antibiotic resistant bacteria. So after the FDA scientists published their paper announcing this, Recombinetics, which was the GMO firm that had made these cattle, they kind of did sorry, we didn't spot that. And we're going to withdraw these cattle because they had proposed to commercialize them. And so for the time being, those cattle are withdrawn from the commercialization pipeline, but they were trying very hard in Brazil to commercialize them before this happened. And I suspect that what will happen is that the company will do a few more tests and come back, and say, we've really got clean cattle this time. But of course, the question is always, how carefully are they really looking for these unintended effects? Because the EU Commission's approach is very much don't look, don't find. They're not even looking seriously at studies that show unintended effects of gene editing. EFSA has been pretty bad on this as well. They've just said, it's not worth looking at the unintended effects. There's nothing to be learned there, which I find really bizarre. We should be looking at those effects and looking at what they do, what those effects do.
There's also the effects that you're looking for, but with unintended effects, there's also effects that you don't expect and they pop up. So you should also look for the unknowns, basically.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Even the intended edit will have unintended effects down the line. And that's what they should be looking at. At the very least, they should be doing omics. They should be doing whole genome sequencing, looking at the whole genome, typically to look for what's called off-target effects, which is unintended effects, not at the editing site. To look for those, they use inadequate screening methods. It would be very easy and relatively cheap to just use the proper methods and see everything in the genome that editing event has created. But they're not doing that, and it's a problem.
What happens when you eat that? Because is it just like, for example, if it's a little bit more toxic or is it possible if you eat that you're also more antibiotics resistant, or does it not transfer like that?
In the case of the gene-edited cattle, we really don't know what. Even scientists who are very worried about finding the antibiotic-resistant genes in the cattle happily tell me that they have no idea whether this would present a real risk to human health or not. They're just not sufficiently inside that situation to look at all the risks. But somebody should be looking at them. And at the moment, we simply don't have a clue what those risks are. Somebody should be looking. And I would say first of all, the company, the developer needs to look. And secondly, the regulator needs to look. And at the moment, neither of them are looking. And, we're faced in the UK with this total deregulation of new GM is on the cards here. And the government is simply asserting that any change that can be produced through gene editing can also happen naturally. Well, that's not the case. Gene editing can do a lot of things that either would not happen naturally or are highly unlikely to happen naturally. So this is a triumph of faith over science. These are faith-based statements. It's safe, it's precise, there's nothing to worry about. They have no evidence on which to back that up.
Well, I also thought the argument was strange, because they say it can happen naturally, but they need very artificial methods to induce those changes. So it kind of
Absolutely. And we've always said, fine, if it can happen naturally, go out and find one in the field that has happened naturally. And then you will have to withdraw your patent, because if it's happened out there in the field, you have no right to patent it. It's not an invention of yours. It is a natural occurrence. So there's a lot of doublethink going on, what we call doublethink. The mutually contradictory ideas are being held here about this technology. And I have never seen such a failure in logic on the part of industry and also the regulators. They just seem to have thrown logic out of the window.
So the third one is the bacteria, because the precision fermentation has been used by pharmaceutical companies for a long time already, for example, to produce insulin. But now they're using the same processes to produce what they say is butter or milk. And in the US, it's already, they say, well, it's the same protein as milk, so we can put this on the market as milk. What are the risks of eating these products, and also of editing bacteria? You already mentioned the antibiotics resistance, but bacteria can perhaps spread more quickly than plants.
Yeah. About the risks of gene editing bacteria, I think the person that you need to interview there is Professor Jack Heinemann at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. Because he knows a lot about this topic. Also, Dr. Michael Antoniou is a genetic engineer who would know about that field of things. It's slightly outside our sphere, so I probably won't go into that. Sorry, what was your other question? You had another part of the question.
No, I think those were the questions about the genetic editing, but there's also, you hear a lot or you read a lot about synthetic biology. And will this fall into the category of new genomic techniques, or is this again like a whole new brand?
Well, I'm not sure what they're going to call it, but lab-grown meat does involve often the genetic engineering technologies. There are real dangers with this stuff. Lab-grown meat, lab-grown milk, all these proteins that can be produced in bioreactors. There are major problems with this technology. Yes, I think that this stuff could make people quite sick. And that is based on some very anecdotal evidence. You may think that's a contradiction in terms. Anecdotes that I have heard, particularly in the US, from people who have tried to eat what I call fake meat products. And these are products which do use genetic engineering of yeast to produce certain substances that then go into the fake burger or whatever it is. And there's been an awful lot of reports that have come my way about people becoming violently ill after eating these things. Not everybody by any means. Some people seem to be able to tolerate it just fine. But some people have severe vomiting, diarrhea. One person had a really severe bout of vomiting and diarrhea and seems to have got kidney damage from it. We simply do not know what what changes to the proteins are going to happen. Also, what other proteins are going to be produced in the process. That can happen. So you can have completely unknown proteins that we simply haven't had in the food supply before. They can be present in these products. There are major environmental problems with these bioreactor technologies. They are very prone to contamination, and they will require intensive cleaning between every batch. So that means disinfecting of the whole system. Will companies doing this adhere to these principles? Because bioreactor technologies, as we know, have been used in the making of pharmaceuticals for years. And normally they have very tightly controlled processes of making sure there's no contamination, disinfecting between batches, purification techniques that are highly effective, and also tests that they apply to make sure that the final product is really pure and doesn't contain any unintended contaminants. I mean, are these lab-grown meat people really going to go through all these processes that are necessary for making pharmaceuticals? Who's going to police that? Have they thought about the amount of energy that these things take? Because they take a huge amount of energy. A bioreactor is very, very energy hungry. It's also very resource hungry in that there are substances that you have to feed the cells that are going to become your fake meat product. You have to feed it with nutrients and growth factors, growth hormones. And these substances are extremely expensive to produce, and you have to produce them in other bioreactors. So you've got bioreactor systems to feed your lab-grown meat bioreactor system, and the whole process, if this is going to feed any significant number of people in the same way that we're feeding people with meat at the moment, these bioreactors are going to have to cover vast territories, and that amount of energy that they will take up is not going to be able to be produced through solar or anything like that. I'm sitting at the moment in a basically solar powered house, and I know how careful you have to be with your energy use. If you have a little meter thing in your house, it tells you where the energy is going. And my goodness, you put the oven on for a couple of hours and that's your solar energy gone for the day. So, these things are going to be extremely energy hungry. They're going to require huge amounts of fossil fuels to run, and they're going to produce large amounts of toxic waste. Every time you disinfect the system, that is highly toxic and contaminated waste that then you're going to have to deal with. So I think that the investors who have gone into these projects, I think that they're being misled and lied to. This is a bubble that will burst. And I think that we will go back to what many people know intuitively is the way to go, which is certainly in our country, in England, it's pasture-fed meat because we have tons and tons of grass here. The grass grows like crazy because we usually get a lot of rain. That land is not particularly suitable for arable, so we can't just turn it over to crops. The only thing to do with it, if you want to do something with it, is to turn out cattle or pigs or sheep and to eat those animals, actually. I don't want to be targeted here by the vegan lobby. I myself am vegetarian. I'm not a vegan, but I am vegetarian. But I recognize that not everybody suits a vegetarian diet, and there are many people who will continue to eat meat, and that's fine by me, as long as the meat is raised in a humane and fair way to the animal. The animal is treated with respect, and also the byproducts of the animal waste is very, very good for the land. And some farmers would say it's a necessary part of keeping their soil healthy, is using animal manure. So yeah, it's not a problem, basically. Animal livestock rearing in really good regenerative farming systems is not a problem.
So that makes lab-grown meat quite unnecessary.
I think so. And also the funny thing is that the share prices of these lab-grown meat firms are absolutely crashing at the moment. And I'm seeing articles in the mainstream economic press, Wall Street Journal and things like that, saying people have lost their taste for meat substitutes. And I'm really not surprised.
No.
Because, for someone who eats meat, then they're not going to want to eat this edible like substance that comes out of a bioreactor.
Yeah, well, especially when you read how they make it, then it doesn't seem like anything you want to put in your mouth. So.
Exactly.
So let me see. Yeah, because one thing that I suspect is because they are developing all these what they call novel foods. So that's the lab-grown meat, precision fermentation. And my suspicion is a little bit that when they deregulate the all these artificial foods, they use these CRISPR techniques or gene editing. So when you deregulate that, it will be much easier to put these foods on the market, especially because you don't need to label them anymore. Is that something that you run into, or?
Oh, certainly. That is the aim of the GMO companies. They want an easy path to market. They don't want any barriers in their way. I know we criticize EFSA a lot, the European Food Safety Authority, for their lax regulation of GMOs. But I'm really glad that EFSA is in place and has been in place all these years, because EFSA does demand a certain quality of submission, of application. And, certain tests do have to be done at the moment. And I think it's absolutely outrageous that the companies are asking, can we put our products on the market without this testing and without oversight? It's absolutely outrageous. We as the public will bear the risk. They will reap the profits, and that clearly is not the way to go for a transparent food system.
So do you think the EU is kind of a gatekeeper? Because I noticed when the EU passed the chemical legislation REACH, you saw in other countries they started implementing very similar REACH type legislation. So if they deregulate this, will this kind of like enable other countries to also say we can let this go? Or
Absolutely. There are many countries, many continents even across the world that have their eye on the EU on this issue, and they will follow. The EU's GMO regulations have in many ways served as a model for the world. Many countries have emulated them, and this is partly practicality because, countries like India and many African countries wish to export their food, crops that they have grown, they like to export them to the EU. So they want to adhere to the same standards as the EU. So certainly I'm absolutely certain that if the EU does go ahead and deregulate, it will really be a free-for-all over the entire world. That's the danger.
Okay, so what can people do now, like to inform themselves, to perhaps avoid this legislation being passed, and for themselves to avoid eating GMOs?
Yeah, there are some petitions. There is a petition that's being hosted at the moment by certain groups like Friends of the Earth Europe and Slow Food.
Okay.
And these petitions are demanding that new GMOs be regulated as GMOs, as, by the way, the European Court of Justice several years ago said they should be. They said these products are GMOs, they should be regulated as GMOs. So people can sign those petitions. They can Google maybe petition keep GMOs regulated, Friends of the Earth EU or something, and find it on those sites. Similarly, people should contact their MEPs. In the UK we have MPs, and they should demand that new GMOs continue to be regulated as the older style GMOs, and they should point out that the risks are unknown, the safety profile is unknown, and for the sake of transparency, so that farmers know what they're growing and consumers can continue to choose what they're eating and putting in their bodies, we need to maintain three things. First of all, traceability. Second thing is safety assessments for health and environment. And the third thing is labeling. Those are the three magic things that we want to keep with new GMOs as with old GMOs.
Good. Well, where can people find your work if they want to know more about what you're doing?
Sure. Our website is called GMWatch. The URL is gmwatch.org. And if they go to gmwatch.org, they will find that they can subscribe to our free newsletters. This is a way that anyone can keep in touch with what's going on. We will alert people when petitions come up and, when we want people to write to their elected representatives. We often share the work of other NGOs. So when Friends of the Earth or another group comes out with an initiative, we'll announce it. New reports, we'll announce those as well. So do sign up, and I'm afraid we always have to ask for donations. Like you, we are a reader-supported organisation mostly, and we do rely on the people who can help us keep going.